Welcome to Canadian Agriculture Unpacked. I'm your host, Bob Friesen. With me, co-host Wayne Easter, a 28-year veteran of the House of Commons, former Solicitor General, and longtime chair of the House of Commons Finance Committee. Easter has more than paid the rent for the space that he occupies on this planet. With us, special guest Mark Hemis, who is a founding partner of the Quorum Group. Welcome to the show, Mark. Now, Mark, I can call you Mark, or should I call you Mr. Hemis?
No, you can call me Mark.
Mark is fine. Mark, you know something? If Mark doesn't know about, if there's something that Mark doesn't know about rail grain movement, it's not important to know. He, in fact, is a longtime railroader, I believe, for CN Rail, until he started the Quorum Group together with his partner. And he knows a lot about grain rail movement. And I always get confused, Mark. Is it grain rail movement or is it rail grain movement?
It's a good question. We just call it grain movement. So
grain movement. Okay, now I was talking to you a couple of days ago, Mark, and you said it's been a pretty good winter for moving grain. Can you give us a bit of a report on movement, what's happening at the port, etc.?
Well, this year has been really good. Probably you have to think about it in terms of comparison to last year. Last year was not great. It was probably one of the worst years we've seen in a while. Car cycles were long. The vessel lineups at the ports were high. There were long periods of stock shortages at the port. It was all compounded by labor actions and threats of labor actions and forest fires later, earlier in the year, through the summer. Starting in late November, all the railway performance was very bad, and it took over 30 weeks for them to recover. So we went through just about the whole peak period with nothing but problems. In some cases, we had some months car cycles were up at 18 to 20 days. And another key measure that we watch is the balance of stocks between the country and the port. And there was some times where it was abysmal. We had order fulfillment. Order fulfillment is how well the railways are supplying the cars that are requested by the grain companies. It was down in the 40% range. So that was horrible. Now you look at this year, this is one of the best years we've seen probably in 12 to 14 years. Total time in the system is down to 41 days, which is about 3.2% lower than last year, but the loaded transit time is down to 5.7 days. That's the time it takes to go from the country to the port on average. That's 12.8% better than we saw last year. Railway cycle times are down to 13 days. That's 9% lower. The stocks at the port are stocks of the port. They're balanced, which is what we're always looking for. And the vessel time in the port is down to almost 9 days, which is 27% better than last year. You want to put it into perspective. Last year, vessel demurrage was a little over $60 million for all three ports. And that's probably the highest we've ever seen in the 25 years that we've been doing this. That's how bad it was that last year. I don't think we're going to see much in the way of vessel demurrage this year. So it's funny how it just flips over like that. And I think a large part of it is that we really haven't had any big issues this year. We haven't had huge environmental rivers. We haven't had fires. We haven't had labor action. So the real issue that we always see is as soon as the railways have a problem, it takes them forever to recover. And so it's about resilience of their operations and their recoverability. So we had a good year like this, and there's nothing in their way. They can actually do really well. As soon as something goes wrong, it takes them forever to get back into the swing of things.
So, and I think you mentioned, I don't know, you mentioned that the volume was higher this year than it's been for a long time, correct?
Well, yes, yeah, I failed to mention that. This is the highest grain supply we have ever had to handle in the history of the grain industry in Canada. It's about 92 million tons. And if you think back to that period from say 2000 to 2010, if we saw 60 million tons in a year, we thought this was fantastic. Um, I think post CWB, we started seeing some pretty significant growth. The average growth rate from say 1980 to 2010 was about 1.5 to 2% a year. In that time since the CWB, like 2012, we're seeing 3 and 4% per year, and that and it's not entirely about the CWB. To be honest, it's that we have seen some pretty uh, major technical advances in production in the agronomics. The rapid changeover to direct seeding, some of the applications of herbicides, pesticides, the way people farm today, and the genetics of the grain themselves has really added to this ability to phenomenally increase yield rates. So that we kind of marked that 2012 period as when we really started to see some change. And it was a confluence of a bunch of stuff that came together that allowed us to do that.
So you mentioned $60 million in vessel demurrage. And for those watching that don't know what vessel demurrage is simply when ocean-going vessels have to sit in the parking lot waiting to be loaded. You're saying that 60 million bucks last year, this year probably almost nothing. That simply
Yep.
means that's $60 million more in farmers' pockets because they end up paying for demurrage, if I'm correct.
Ultimately, they'll pay a big portion of it. The grain companies will probably absorb some, but it's essentially the way that marketplace is structured. It really flows down back through the supply chain to the producer, and the producer has no control over the supply chain. So that's a reason for a lot of that regulatory stuff that goes on.
Wayne, you got something?
Yeah, yeah. I do get the CNA, it's the Canadian National Grain Report. I still get that all the time, and their movement, and I agree 100% with Mark. If I looked back at last year's movement just on their line, and Mark is talking about them all, there's been quite a turnaround due to a number of things. But if any of the costs can be taken out of the system, especially demurrage, it makes no sense. You have to have, you have to have ships in the harbor waiting to be loaded because you don't want the grain to be backed up at the elevator system at port either. But uh, the logistics of that system, making it function, is complicated. But if you can get grain to port in time to meet that ship on time, it makes a huge difference back on the prairies for primary producers, and that's in part what it was all about. It There was, and I don't know on this, Mark, there was for a time there was really quite a mix-up within the port system itself, whether it was Prince Rupert or Vancouver or wherever, getting the right grain to the right terminal, to the right ship. That's now fixed, right?
Yeah, I think two things that really made a difference. And you have to go way back. If you go back to the late 1990s, there was, I guess the way to put it is that when the Canadian Wheat Board was doing the marketing of things, and they got pretty good about this, but essentially they were selling grain from the port terminal, which basically said that your inventory to sell was wholly based on whatever the capacity was for at the port position. They, collectively between the CWB and the grain companies in that 2003 to 2008 period, they moved from what is referred to as a push system to a pull system. They used to push the grain to the port, sell it from there. Now they're selling grain right from the farmer's bin. And that it kind of roughly equates to a just-in-time system, but it allows the grain companies that when they sign a contract, now they're going to go out and they're going to shop for the product that's going to meet the terms of that sale. And it allows them to have a really, really tight control on the inventory. The downside of that is that you start the sales program about 3 months before you're actually loading a vessel, right? So it all has to meet together. And when one part of that chain between the country and the port starts to fall apart, and that major part of the chain is the railway, then both ends start to suffer. The stocks in the country elevator system start to go through the roof. The ports don't have any grain to load. The vessels that they've chartered, and they have to charter them 6 to 8 weeks ahead of time, they're all sitting there waiting for the grain that was planned to load to them, and then the whole system starts to fall apart.
Just Bob, I think it'd be useful if maybe Mark could, for those that don't know the grain industry, and I was, as Mark would know, I was a big wheat board supporter, but time moves on. And I was in, I've seen their maps and their systems within the wheat board offices in Winnipeg, in terms of the railways and all the connections to get grain to port. But I don't think the general public understands how complicated this is. You're pulling, as Mark says, grain from a farmer, say in Prince Albert. It has to go by truck onto onto an elevator, up an elevator, into a railway car, then through that system, and be matched up with a delivery point to get in a ship through another elevator. So it is an unbelievable complicated system, but it works, or it's working now. Not always does it work.
No, and I think the difference on the CWB side is just there's two major differences. CWB had a greater control over the inventory management at the port terminal. There was good things and bad things about that. As you say, there were pluses and minuses in that change. The shift over from having the marketing responsibility lay with CWB to having the grain companies do the marketing themselves. That took a bit to get through. There were some holes in it, and there were some issues with how you track it, but they very quickly made that shift. I don't have, I see pluses and minuses with both sides as well. But the one thing that it did do was, with the grain companies having complete control over the inventory in their facilities that they own, they became a lot more shrewd and efficient in the way that inventory management happened within their systems. Like I say, It took them a few months to get the hang of it, but they got really good at it very quickly. And I think that was a big positive for the system. And it was something that lent to the ability for producers to have a little bit of confidence in whether or not they could sell their grain or whether it was going to sit in their bin for a year or two. So we're really seeing the carry forward stocks have really decreased. Where we used to see 15 to 18% carry forward at the end of the year, we're down to 7-8% carry forward on average. So that basically means that we're selling the good grain faster, getting more money for it. That I think that's one of the parts of this whole change that's been a positive. But again, as soon as something happens in that piece between the country and the port, it really has an effect on the whole system. It creates incredible costs in the country because they have to hold the grain longer. It creates the costs at the ports because the vessels have to wait longer. And all that cost comes back into the system, and ultimately it comes out of the pockets of producers.
Yeah, which I mean remains a puzzlement to farmers. I think why they have to pay for those delays. But we used to, and I mean, railways have always been the whipping post for anything that goes wrong in grain movement. But they're also always accused of leaving grain till the end. They'll ship other commodities that perhaps are higher paying commodities, higher paying freight commodities. And so they leave grain till the end because they know that the grain will be there when they get to it. But with this just in time that you're talking about, you would think grain companies would be really upset if that was still the case. So is there more timely movement of grain than there used to be, or do you see that they may still be leaving it till the end?
It depends on the circumstances in the moment. It's funny, but you go back 10 or 12 years when Hunter Harrison was around, he actually stood in front of a Bay Street or Wall Street group and said, we like grain because we make money at it and we don't have to move it right away. If we can't move it this week or next week, we can move it next month because they don't have any other way of getting it to port. When you think about the broader spectrum of all the markets that railways deal with, you start to itemize each group and which ones are competitive and which are not. If you go to intermodal, the container business, yes, it's competitive between CN and CP, but where the big competition occurs is between the ports. If a if a container company or a shipping line is not getting the service from, say, the Port of Vancouver or the Port of Prince Rupert, they can option to Oakland or they can go to LA Long Beach. And so the competition becomes not between the railways, but between the ports. So if the railways don't serve the ports adequately, they're really putting the whole basket at play, and it could move to a different port, which means a different railway, a U.S. railway, for instance. So there's that competitive game that goes on. You take potash, for instance. Potash is directly competitive between CN and CP. Potash mines have the great advantage of being served at almost every mine, except for maybe one or two, are served by both railways. If one railway fails, they can turn around and they can move it with the other railway. And, you take away a couple of trains from a railway, and that's a couple of $1 million. So that kind of penalty occurs with the grain industry. Out of the 390 some odd elevators that are in the country, there's only 13 or 14 that are actually accessible by both railways. So they don't have that competitive option. in the country with the grain companies. Now the railways will turn around and say, well, they could truck to a different elevator, but realistically, truck costs are like 3 times
Huge.
higher than what a rail is. So you're basically giving away all your profitability if you want to play that game. And that's why that excuse, in my opinion, doesn't really hold any water.
Well, you talk about competition between the railways, and then, of course, you have to talk about that our farmers are the furthest from tidewater of any other exporting farmer probably in the world,
In the world,
and
In the
absolutely,
that
world, yeah,
are none.
and
absolutely.
and that the U.S. Farmers, they have the option of the Mississippi River system. So I
Yeah,
did some research on the cost of barging grain for a farmer to barge his grain down the Mississippi versus a farmer in Winnipeg railing it to Vancouver, and found out it's a lot cheaper. Now I've got this pet project in mind. Easter and Wilkinson both think I'm crazy, but Prime Minister Carney has this major project office, and I think that one of the projects should be dredging the Mississippi up into the prairies, and then farmers would have that second option. But maybe you like it, I don't know. But on a more serious note, you mentioned that the railways haven't had to put up with a lot of unforeseen circumstances this winter. Have they gotten better at getting out of those unforeseen circumstances if they happen? Or is it just the luck of the draw that this winter we just didn't have a lot?
it's good fortune. And that probably remains a lot of people in the industry's bugaboos is that, yes, knock on wood, this has been a great year and we haven't had any big issues. We haven't had rock slides through the mountains. We haven't had huge avalanches. We haven't had fires. We haven't had floods. Just keep your fingers crossed and we can make it through. But um, the railways have had their issues with trying to maintain a certain degree of resilience. Some of it has to do with staffing. They have probably one of the hardest chores is hiring staff that are competent and qualified. And you don't go down to manpower resources and pick up a conductor. You've got to bring them in, you've got to train them, you've got to qualify them. And that's a 6 to 8 month proposition. So if all of a sudden we see a surge, it's not like they can go get somebody off the street to run a train. That doesn't wash. So I have sympathy from them on that front. Um, the the issue of resilience is that how many people are you keeping in reserve, and there's a cost associated with that, and they're a business. Their first priority is to their shareholder as opposed to customers or government or farmers. So that's the hard truth, and it's something that they can do, and especially seeing as how they have the very best. It's a duopoly. A lot of people would say it's really two monopolies, and so if you're a monopoly, right?
Yeah. You talk about resilience. What about redundancy? Are they better at building redundancy into the system?
No, the question becomes kind of almost actuarial. Is that how much redundancy do I want to put in place, and what happens if I don't put it in place? And I mean, this goes back to the Hunter Harrison era where you run your assets into the ground. If locomotives aren't always running, if crews aren't always working, then you're wasting money. So it's all about profitability, um, and also safety. I would say that they're very focused on that, but mostly about profitability. So if it costs money to keep redundancy, they better have a really good excuse to do it, because otherwise um, there's going to be hell to pay.
Just a
And
go ahead, Matt.
I was just going to say is that there are a lot of there's a few CEOs who thought that they would try to um, kind of play the middle game and put some redundancy in or build their resilience, and then the activist shareholders come along and say, no, you're not making enough money, and they kick them out and they bring in somebody who will do it. So it's a really tough balance to keep. Sorry, Wayne.
Yeah, no, not a problem. I was just wondering on the because this is something I definitely don't know. What about the rolling stock now in terms of hopper cars? Who's providing most of them? The wheat board had quite a fleet, but where did they go? And basically, who's responsible now, or there'd be a number of bodies, I expect, for maintaining hopper cars, so they're available.
Well, briefly, what happened back in there was a long debate as to what was going to happen with the government hopper fleet. At its height, between the provinces of Alberta, Saskatchewan, the Wheat Board, and the federal government, there was almost 18,000 hopper cars that were government owned, and they were getting older. Once they hit 30 years, they need to go through a major retrofit. But as they get closer to 50, at 50 years, basically the American Association of Railroads, which is the governing body that determines how rolling stock has to be maintained, says that once it hits 50 years, you can't interchange it between railways. And that is kind of the key point, that when a rail car hits 50 years, it basically becomes razor blades.
Yeah.
So they had to do something, and through a series of negotiations, and one of the things that came of that was a major change in how railways were allowed to depreciate and include the cost of new fleet into the MRE. Both railways went out and had whole fleets of high capacity hopper cars brought in, and it started in about 2017, 18, and then when the change came in C49 in 2019, they went whole hog. And there were probably about 3 factories, railcar factories in North America, including National Steel Car in Hamilton, that were just pumping out high capacity cars, and they're vastly superior cars to what the old government car fleet had in place. They're higher capacity by about 15%. They're shorter, so you can put more cars in a train. They're a lot more resilient in the way that they've constructed them. So it was a very, very positive move. So the vast majority of the old government hopper car fleet is gone. I think there might be a couple of thousand left in service. The rest of them have either been sold off to short lines who use them for storage, or they've been cut up and scrapped. So,
Okay, let's talking about cars before we go on to the next issue. There are still producer cars, right?
yeah, actually, a little bit of a surprise. There was a slight increase in the producer cars in the 24-25 crop year. Probably owing to the service issues that had gone through.
Just Bob, for those that won't understand this, by producer cars, you mean using a car to ship grain for the producer, not the producer owning the car, right?
That's right.
Yeah,
Because
sure.
some people will misunderstand. That's why I interrupt. Some people
Good.
will misunderstand what a producer car is.
No, I'm glad you clarified that. So
Uh,
it's a farmer actually marketing the grain him or herself, right?
yeah, instead of selling your grain to a grain company at a grain elevator in the country, you have the option of finding a buyer for the grain yourself, and then getting a permit from the Canadian Grain Commission to do that. They issue that permit, and then you can order a rail car yourself directly from the railway. And that's always been almost sacrosanct right of a producer to be able to do that. Without going into a lot of history about it, it goes back to the early 1900s, where there was a lot of fights between producers and grain companies. And they wanted their option to sell it themselves. The upside of it is that you can sometimes make a little bit more money doing it that way, and everything's in your control. The downside is sometimes it's hard to get a rail car from the railway, because basically on the priority list, producer cars fall right to the bottom. The second thing is that all the liability until that car gets delivered to the end buyer lies with the producer. Now, the way that some people get around that is that they make deals with dealer companies like Anderson's out of the U.S., because a lot of these producer cars are now going into the United States, and the dealer, the grain dealer, will absorb a lot of the liability. But all the same, if something happens or the buyer gets the grain and they say, "Oh, I don't like it," then the producer doesn't get paid, or he's got to wait a long time to get paid. And they got to wait a long time anyway. So there's pluses and minuses with it, but it still gets used. And then there's producers who are still doing a fair bit of it.
All right, let's go into another area. And I'm sorry Jack Wilkinson couldn't be on because of technical reasons, because he was president of the CFA when Goodale, then Agricultural Minister Goodale, got rid of the crow rate, which was a subsidy to help farmers move grain to the West Coast. He didn't have to eliminate it. Now I'm poking at Wayne's government. Didn't have to eliminate it, but like all other governments around the world, they like to come home and say we have to change domestic policy because the world is telling us to, and got rid of the crow rate, which actually in the Uruguay round they only had to reduce volume and actual value of the crow rate, but be that as it may, it's gone. And it was replaced by the maximum revenue entitlement policy. Is that still relevant? Or is there so much opportunity to manipulate the MRE that it's really worthless?
A little bit of a history on that. The crow rate was gradually taken away over about an 8-year period back in the 1880s. And then it was replaced with a CTA managed rate scale that was fixed. Basically, they published a rate in August, and it stayed the same through the whole year. Every August, it would change. The MRE was brought in 1999, and it was actually something that was developed between the railways and the government that employed what they call a Ramsey pricing model. And it just says that at the end of the year, your total average rate has to be X times whatever the inflation is. But what you do between August and July 31st, insofar as the rate structure, is totally up to you. So there was some rules around it. Basically, they had to give 30 days worth of notice before they increase a rate, but they could decrease a rate at will. So that went in place effective 2001, just shortly before we got our job as the grain monitor. And ever since then, they've been continually tweaking the MRE as you went along. But I would take exception with the idea that it's manipulative or it's irrelevant. I don't agree. I think it's a very important guardrail that you have to put in place, and it needs to be there. And it, I would point to probably two different reasons. First of all, the pricing of grain comes in a global marketplace. As a result, Canadian grain companies and grain producers are price takers, right? So um, essentially, that makes the whole supply chain. Um, they got to basically kneel at the foot of the global marketplace insofar as price is concerned. And the other part of it is that grain farmers, grain producers don't have any control over that, nor do they have a control over how the supply chain is operated, because the way our system is set up, and I don't ever see it changing, is that a producer will make his decisions on how he grows the grain, what he's going to grow, et cetera, and what he's going to sell. But he's going to sell it to a grain company. Um, and the grain company is the one who controls the logistical costs that are associated with that, including how they manage their relationship with the railways, with the ocean vessel lines, et cetera, et cetera. So, and because we're price takers, all of those incremental costs that happen in the supply chain are going to get fed back to the producer, and it's going to come out of his pocket. So if you don't have any ability to place some kind of control mechanism on the rates structure that the railways are going to have, because that's what the government does have control over. They don't have any control over the ocean vessel side, but they can control the rail side. And that really is a guardrail that's put in place to help make sure that the producers do not really pay some usurious amounts of money, nor does it allow the railways to use rate structures as a means to demarket the country elevator network and mold it into something that really works to their benefit as opposed to the industry as a whole. That's why
So
I
you,
think the RE is important.
so you think in aggregate it works, but isn't it the case though that a guy in Saskatchewan, it's applied in aggregate, right? On total volume. So a
Uh,
guy in Saskatchewan might pay far more freight in proportion to someone, let's say southern Saskatchewan, northern Saskatchewan. They can adjust it on a per site basis, can't they?
they do, and most of it is mileage related. The further you are from port, of course, the more that you're going to pay. But when you actually look at the at the rate structure itself, um, your cost per mile ton, for instance, as a statistic, for somebody who's closer to the port, is much higher than it is on a mile ton for somebody who's in, say, Davidson, Saskatchewan. So it is, and by the way, the rates have always been mileage, mileage uh,
Right.
structured. So even when it was under the Crow.
Yeah, I did just add in, and I think Mark has the right words. It's a guardrail, and it does. I think it does hold the rates within reason, because of the if at the end of the year or whenever that calculation's done, the railways are over that rate, then they got a problem from the government, and I think they're penalized somehow. I just forget how it is now, Mark. But yeah, I remember the Crow rate well. I was in a lot of demonstrations trying to save the Crow rate, and one of my first votes in Parliament, I'll never forget it, because after spending all my time in the farm movement supporting the Crow rate, then I'm in the government that's going to do away with it. Uh, I told Chrétien I was going to vote against the government, and of course I'm in the back row, and Chrétien is in the front row there, and I'm the only Liberal that's voting against it. and he looks back at me, and I'm a new Green MP. You know how that'd feel. When I come out, come out walking through the lobby, Chrétien puts his hand on my shoulder and he says, "Wayne, that just cost you chair of the Agriculture Committee." So I said, "That's fine. I had to do what I had to do, and you had to do what you had to do. But that's life in politics. You
Well,
don't always win the fights."
there's a lot of guys that should learn from that because we know how that works. If you want a promotion, you capitulate. But he also didn't forgive you for something else. But
Did
we won't go into that.
Yeah.
We won't go into that today. So, Mark, eh, taking the Hunter Harrison example into consideration, and the fact that there's a lot of talk about how costs could be reduced and efficiency could be improved. Who should pay for this? Like, should it be done through government subsidies? I mean, people would find it hard to stomach, I think, governments helping railways who are making billions of dollars for their shareholders, helping them improve, say, dual tracking, whatever. How can we reduce freight rates? And how can we improve efficiency if the railways are perhaps taking it too casually? Do we need more government regulation?
Perhaps.
Tell me if you can't answer. If you don't want to answer, tell me to go to hell in such a way that I'll look forward to the trip.
Uh, I I have to be careful about how, because one of the pieces in our mandate as a grain amount areas is that we are not prescriptive, and so I try to keep my opinions on that sort of thing to myself. But um, the one part of it is that there is there are parts within the regulatory regime that would allow for holding railways' feet to the fire insofar as their committed level of service. There are common carrier obligations, et cetera, and there are the mechanisms that are in place today um, under filing a level of service complaint are maybe not as tight as they could be, and maybe not exercised in the same manner. Um, it's pretty common knowledge that companies that file a level of service complaint against a railway become the target of that railway insofar as any kind of future service is concerned. So if you don't like the service and you use your regulatory mechanisms to try and fix the problem, in all likelihood, the railways are going to behave in a manner that's just going to make your problem worse. So how do you deal with the regulatory environment that works like that? I can't count the number of times that we've been in discussions with people at the government who say, well, if you don't like it, why don't you file a level of service complaint? And the shipper will say, if I file a level of service complaint, it's going to cost me $1 million, and I'm probably going to end up with worse service than I already have. So how do you deal with that? That's not an answer, but it basically explains the situation that we have today. Is that how do you make the regulatory environment that exists today actually function in the way that it is intended? And I think there's a lot of people in the government who just rip their hair out about this sort of thing, trying to figure out how do we make this work, because actually adding more regulations to this is just going to result in the same thing happening over and over again. It's almost a catch-22, right?
And I can tell you, Mark, within government, if you, as a member of parliament, really go hard on a department over an issue, somehow your file goes to the bottom of the list and it takes even longer. I mean, it's a catch-22 too, and that's basically what you're saying. And it how do you deal with that? It's you can't regulate love there, Bob.
No, I mean
Well,
it
Regulation
happens.
won't solve the problem.
It
and
happens with regulators.
Yeah.
I, I mean, when I was involved in the turkey industry, processors didn't dare complain about what the CFIA was doing in their plant because they knew that if they complained about it, it would get worse.
and that and you it compounds itself because you're essentially dealing with a duopoly slash monopoly. That's it's almost an untenable situation, but I don't know what kind of solution. And I'm not necessarily talking about politicians. I'm talking about senior bureaucrats who just say, "How do we deal with this?" Because at the same time, those senior bureaucrats also have to go to the railways and ask for favors, to do things like help me build a bridge or get a tunnel here or different things that have to do with industrial and market development. And you can't turn around and ask for a favor there and then slap them in the head on something else. I do not envy their job.
Did the CTA get their own motion authority?
They have it, but it's weird. Essentially, if they want to pursue an own motion complaint, they have to first ask for permission from the minister. And the one attempt that they had doing that was with service in the Vancouver area. I don't know if you recall that, but it became a lot of analogous evidence. The grain industry was fortunate because you've got two different funnels that are providing them with performance data, but everybody else basically brought lawyers. And it really didn't go in the direction that they wanted it to. And while the CTA has the authority to demand certain performance data from the railways, it's a laborious task. And so it's not the same as the STB in the United States. They don't have the same kind of authority, nor does Transport Canada have the same authority that, say, the FRA, the Federal Railway Administration in the U.S. has. So it's a different kind of regulatory relationship.
Oh well, our prime minister doesn't seem to have the same authority that the president in the U.S. has either. So that's
Governance structure. Yeah.
it's just Canada, I guess. Wayne, you have anything? Any questions?
No, no. I think we've covered a lot of ground and some interesting areas there, Mark, that I
My
certainly
pleasure.
never thought about. The I guess going forward, I mean, we've all heard lots of time. What would double tracking do? I mean, we are in a unique situation in Canada in which farmers are further from port on average than any other country in the world. You can't you can't truck all the grain from Saskatchewan or Manitoba to Vancouver or Thunder Bay.
We need
Uh,
that Mississippi Canal into the prairies.
Listen, Bob, the do you think in this day and age, I often mention this, would the government of Canada today, number one, they wouldn't have the backbone, but would they, even if they did decide to, would you ever be able to build the St. Lawrence Seaway? They actually moved towns at that time to build the St. Lawrence Seaway. Those kind of big projects you can't get done in the environment we live in today, and it'd be even tough, I think, to build a double track.
Anyway, dual tracking. Yeah, dual tracking, Mark, and add an answer on loading in the rain in Vancouver as well.
On double track railways, for instance, almost the entire line between here and Jasper, between Edmonton and Jasper, is double track. The whole line between, because CN and CP cooperate on the line between Kamloops and Vancouver, you've got a track on either side of the river that one goes south, one goes north. Um, railways will kind of slowly develop a double track by adding sidings, and you just keep adding sidings until eventually it's all double tracked. But you don't need double track because you can use the sidings to keep that velocity going. It's as much an art as it is a science, but they're very, very good at it. Because they always want to, one of their key measures is velocity. They want trains to be moving on average of at least track speed all the time. So I would not say that that's something that goes out of the purview of the railway. They know what's best. I would come back to the St. Lawrence Seaway in the comparison to the Mississippi. I agree with you, Wayne. When they built the Seaway and some of the canals, especially the Welland, I don't know that you could ever do that again. But one of the problems with the St. Lawrence Seaway is that you can only take a handy-sized ship or a lake ship up as far as Thunder Bay because of the width of the locks and the canals. Unfortunately, Panamax vessels weren't around in the 40s and 50s, and that is a detriment. The other thing is, in comparison to the Mississippi River, the dredging and the maintenance of locks, etc., is considered a national security responsibility, and all those costs are covered by the Army Corps of Engineers, which significantly reduces the overall cost of running down the Mississippi. Brilliant thing for anybody who wants to ship product on the Mississippi. On the St. Lawrence Seaway, it's all cost plus. So you want to use the lock systems. It's on a cost recovery basis. Big difference between the two.
Well, I mean, that Mississippi dredging is part of the $125 billion in green box spending that they notify every year. And national security, I mean, farm groups in the U.S. try to say that country of origin food labeling was a national security issue as well. Anyway, go ahead, Mark.
That's it. Now, loading in the rain, it's you got to be really, really specific. Like vessel loading in the rain is problematic. It has been for a long time. They've come up with numerous solutions over the last 30, 40 years. For a long time, they used to put tarps over the hold while it was raining to shed the rain off. Longshoremen didn't like that idea because they didn't like to get up on the hold while it was raining because it becomes silt slippery. They determined that it was a safety problem. So then it became a big issue again where you basically had to stop loading vessels when it was raining. And it rains a lot in Vancouver, needless to say. So they've gone through a bunch of iterations, and there's a number of solutions that they've come up with for loading vessels. They're experimenting with an inflatable tent structure that they can actually put over top of the hold that would not require any of the longshore to actually go onto the top of the hold of the ship. It would just be pulled up with a crane, put on top, and they could load. They've also looked at changing the way that they use what they call cement holes. A lot of vessels have got holes in the hatches where they can open the hole in the hatch, put what they call a teacup on top of it, and then feed through the teacup. Again, you don't have to put somebody up on the hold of the ship to do that. The problem is that in both of those cases, you can't fully load the vessel with those appliances on top of the vessel. So you'd have to wait until it stopped raining to finish the ship. But it's a lot better that you can continue to load an empty hold up to a certain point. The third one that they've is basically employing some science where they're measuring the intensity of the rain and saying that at a certain point, too much rain is going to start to affect the load in the ship. They're going to have to close the doors. But if it's a Scotch mist, for instance, and you're pouring grain into the hold, the volume of air that's coming out of the hold is actually keeping the rain out. So why don't you just keep loading until the intensity of the rain hits a certain point, and then you can shut it down. And so they've got mechanisms in the tipples and in the spouts that are loading the vessels that is measuring the amount of rain that's coming down at any point in time, and they can tell that at a certain intensity they're going to have to shut it down. They have to convince the master of the vessel, the captain of the ship, because he's ultimately the one who decides whether you load or not, because it's his liability once it leaves the dock, right? So it's getting better. The second thing that I would point out is that we have analyzed this for the last 5 years, and the only time that rain has an effect on railways is if they have to stop loading so long that the terminal elevator gets so full that they can't unload any more rail cars. And that happens so infrequently that it can't even be measured statistically. So we get a little bit annoyed when the railways make a lot of noise about the fact that the rain is having an effect on railway operations, and we're going, how? It's statistically you can't see it, but
Yeah, but what about if they can't load in the rain? That increases demurrage, doesn't it?
they can apply a certain force majeure in some cases. But yes, it does increase the potential for demurrage. But as I mentioned earlier, right now our average vessel time in port is under 9 days. And most of the charter party agreements on vessels are 10 to 12 days loading time. So if they get it done if they have to wait a day, they've got some grace in their charter party agreement.
Do they load in the rain in Seattle?
No, but what they have done in Seattle and Portland is they put tariffs on the vessels, on the loading vessels, and they say that if you stop loading, we're going to charge you demurrage. So it would be a two-way demurrage thing. And I don't know this for sure because I'm not privy to their charter party agreements, but what I've been told by some shipping agents that because of those tariffs that they put on, the vessel rates that they get quoted into those terminals are higher than Vancouver, for instance.
Two more quick issues. One, are there any rail issues going east?
You have to kind of put it into context. Insofar as Western grain is concerned, it really only represents about 2.5% of the total movement of Western grain. So, yeah, there's occasionally some issues, but also the expectation is a car cycle time of 25 to 28 days, as opposed to Western Canada where you're looking at 13 days. So the planned timelines are a lot longer. So there's a lot more forgiveness in what their logistical plan would be. And for any of the eastern grown grain, like in Ontario or Quebec, most of it gets delivered to port position by truck. I don't know whether you've ever gone down to the docks, like at the Viterra or the Bungie facility. The line of trucks, grain trucks going into their facility at any given point in time is pretty long. Same in some of the other locations, Quebec, all through Ontario. Hamilton, it's just a long line of trucks going into the facilities there. So, and they're loading corn and soybeans and the like. There's a little bit of wheat that gets exported, but most of what happens in Eastern Canada moves by truck.
Thunder Bay is not as critical today as it used to be, is it? Like I've been
Um,
in Thunder Bay and seen grain loading there, but and we used to talk about it a lot, but I don't think it's a critical point it used to be.
it's moving. I mean, put it in context again. Vancouver does 29 to 31 million tons a year. Thunder Bay is doing 8, 9 million tons a year. It used to be, I mean, if you go all the way back to the 60s to the 70s, Thunder Bay was the biggest grain export port in North America. And in fact, even today, the total storage capacity of the licensed elevators in Thunder Bay is second only to Vancouver. So their capability is phenomenally high. Um, they, you know, but they are limited in the fact that the cost of moving through Thunder Bay moves kind of a line that sits around the Saskatchewan-Manitoba border, where moving into, say, the Eastern European and Western European countries from Manitoba is more cost effective to go through Thunder Bay, and west of that line to just about anywhere in the world is more cost effective to go through the West Coast. At one point in time, that line would have been right in the middle of Saskatchewan, but the way that logistics has changed, including rail rates, it's moved that line pretty
Further
much to the
west.
Saskatchewan Manitoba border. So, 9 million tons, given all that, is still pretty good for Thunder Bay. And the majority of it is moving in Lakers down to the lower river at, Montreal, Quebec,
Yeah.
Trois-Rivières.
One last question for me, Mark. Has Trump entered your world?
Um,
There's no world he hasn't entered.
yeah, his influence of this is overridden by demand for the product. um, Probably the one place where it really has gotten on people's nerves is the canola side.
Yeah.
And I there are a couple of crush facilities that specialize, for instance, in canola oil that's used by McDonald's. Trump likes his fries, and it serves all of North America.
Yeah.
So I just wonder how he deal with that. But I mean, putting all these things are still covered by the customer rules. What comes out of that, I don't know. It's kind of the same as putting a tariff on potash. That's not smart.
It's not
Yeah.
smart at all. I've actually talked to some congressional reps down there, even Republican ones. They'll never say it publicly, but boy, is that ever hurting? Is that a way to hurt our own farmers? I mean,
Well, and you're, uh, ultimately, if they put a tariff on oats, I mean, the majority of human grade oats that's going into the United States is coming out of Canada. The majority of their human consumption oil products coming out of Canada. It's canola oil.
Well, the good
make
thing about it is that there's huge industry groups in the U.S. that have already lobbied Washington that customers should stay in place, leave it alone. So they certainly agree with our industries here.
Yeah, but
Anyway, Wayne, do you have anything else?
No, that's. I think we had a great discussion. Thank you. Thank you very much, Mark. I learned a lot.
Thank you
Thank
very
you.
much, Mark.
Appreciate the
I've
opportunity.
I've learned a lot. It was great, very informative. So thank
Well,
you very much.
you're very welcome. Thank you. Appreciate the
And
time.
if you have eaten or will be eating today, thank a farmer.
Take care, guys.